Welcome, everyone. Good evening. It's great to have you. I want to welcome you to the gathering. My name is Matt Miofsky. I'm the lead pastor of this church. The Gathering is a United Methodist church that started 16 years ago in this neighborhood of St. Louis. We now have 3 locations around the city, one in Webster Groves, one in downtown Clayton, and then this site. And we're thrilled to be hosting this because we built this building, then a pandemic hit, and we closed the building, and then we reopened it. And it's great to finally be putting it to good use. And so if you've never been here before, we're really glad to have you here. And the Gathering is really happy to be a sponsor of the Carver Project and the host tonight. So thanks so much for being here. So I want to get us started. I just thought I'd open us in prayer, and we'll get the conversation going. Will you pray with me? Holy God, in whom we live and move and have our being, I pray a prayer of gratitude first for the resources, the community that makes conversations like this possible. I pray that through the questions and answers, the conversations that we have, our minds might be broadened so that we might know you more, our hearts might be enlarged so that we would love you more faithfully, that our hands would be strengthened so we can serve you better in this world. So I pray that your Spirit would bless this time, both in the speaking and in the hearing. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Now I want to introduce Dr. Abram Van Ingen, the Executive Director of the Carver Project and a professor over at WashU.
It's good to see you all this evening. First of all, huge thanks to Matt Miofsky and the Gathering for hosting us this evening. It's a fantastic space. It's lovely to be here. I want to do 2 more quick thank yous before we move on to the program here tonight. The first is to Shelley Milligan, our Managing Director, who continues to make the Carver function go. And the second one is to Rob Crossley, who has been mainly in charge of this evening's event and has made everything organized and perfect and coming together here this evening for us to sit down and listen. And we don't have to think about anything because Rob has already thought of it. So it's fantastic. Thank you, Rob. Now, I just wanted to very quickly, for those of you who are sort of new to the Carver Project, don't exactly know what it is who we are, and what exactly it is that we do, I just wanted to mention that we are this organization here in St. Louis, a Christian nonprofit of faculty and students whose job it is to empower faculty and students to connect university, church, and society. And we do this in all kinds of ways. We have faculty groups, student groups, we have events like this. And it's one of our ways as Christian faculty at WashU to give back to the community and also to nurture up other Christian students as they are learning what it means to be Christian scholars and teachers in the academy today. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. But I also want to say that one of our core values is to bring together what we call uncommon community for creative dialogue. And one of those uncommon communities that we actually bring together is not just the speakers that you're going to hear tonight, but you sitting here in these seats this evening. Now, many of us, most of us in these seats this evening are Christians of some kind or another. But what makes these kinds of events sort of special is the fact that we are Christians who come from all different kinds of churches and all different kinds of traditions. And when I think through the events in my life that bring together Christians from different churches and different traditions, there just aren't that many. It's surprisingly rare. It's a little more uncommon than it ought to be for the body of Christ. And so I was thinking about this recently because in a faculty Bible study that I'm part of, that my friend George Stulak runs, we were working through Ephesians, and this verse came up, this little passage, and I thought, what would it mean for the church to repeat this to itself on a regular basis? And he said to me, well, you should repeat it to the Carver Project. And I thought, okay, fine, George. So I'm going to say this to you this evening. I'm going to read this to you this evening, thinking through how rare it is to be brought together as the body of Christ from so many different places. This is Ephesians 4. And writing to Christians who are themselves followers of Christ, who are not all the same, who do not all agree. And this is what Ephesians says. I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And that's the God we worship all together, all in our different ways. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be together and to think together about difficult conversations, difficult topics. And one of those topics is the role of media in our lives today. So I like to think of myself as fairly young. And Peter Boumgarden, who you'll meet tonight, we co-teach together, and I've been using the movie Office Space in class, and the students have no idea about any in that movie, they beat a fax machine to death with a baseball bat, and they don't know what a fax machine is, and they've never heard of this movie. And then I realized that the movie came out in 1999, and my students were born in 2004 or 5. And so there's a reason that they haven't heard of it. Anyway, I'm old enough to remember when the internet entered our home for the first time and made that awful sound when you dialed up and used up the phone line. We have lived through a revolution in media and technology. We are in a different space today than we ever thought or could have imagined. And how do we live in the truth? And how do we speak grace in the digital media environment that we've got today? These are the kinds of questions that we're going to be thinking about tonight. I did want to pause, though, and say one word. All of the programming that we do, including the program that you're seeing tonight, we offer for free to everyone because we care about these conversations, because we give them out. We are able to offer them free to everyone because of the donors who support us. The donors make us a community that's able to offer programming to our students, to our faculty, and to you all tonight. And this is our 5th Carver Conversation. This is the 5th time that we've been able to offer this to the community. And we have never once asked for donations. But tonight I think we would like to offer, we would like to make an ask. So if you are in the realm of possibility to honor our 5th anniversary here tonight, and if you are willing, we would love for you to be able to make a $50 donation to the Carver Project. And the way to do this is there's tables out back, but there's also a QR code on your program tonight that you can scan to be able to make a donation to the Carver Project. If you are not in that circle of folks who can make such a donation, that's what this is for. You are welcome here, and we still want to bring these conversations to you. So without further ado, I have these talking points, and I missed a few. So first of all, there's a book table out back. You should all know that. There's a book table with books from the folks who are going to be speaking here tonight. So you can get their books out back tonight. But it's my job to introduce them and get out of the way, which I'm now going to do. You've got in front of you a program. It's got a lot of details about who these wonderful speakers are. And I think that instead of repeating all those wonderful details that you have in your hands anyway, I'm just going to keep this short and simple. In order to walk with us through these difficult conversations about truth and grace in the digital age, we have with us tonight Washington Post opinion columnist and editor Christine Emba, New York Times opinion writer David French, YouVersion Chief Content and Partnerships Officer Nona Jones. And all of them are thoughtful and faithful Christians with an array of experience in today's media landscape. And the person who is going to be moderating this tonight and taking questions from you all tonight as well, which, by the way, you can give questions to us to bring to the panelists through the program that you've got in your hand with another QR code. You can send your questions. They'll come right up to Peter. And I know this because Peter and I co-teach together, and he's all about technology. So he's going to have like 16 different iPads up here, and your questions will probably flicker across 4 or 5 of them. I'm an English teacher, and he's from the business school. And I come in with torn up novels. And I say, let's learn together. And he comes in with 16 iPads. And so this is how we teach together. So Peter Boumgarden this year is going to be our moderator. And Peter Boumgarden is the Koch Family Professor of Practice in Family Enterprise at WashU and a faculty fellow with the Carver Project. And that is all that you need to hear from me this evening. Please join me in welcoming Christine Emba, David French, Nona Jones, and Peter Boumgarden.
I feel like I gave Abram 10 minutes to talk, and I heard 3 or 4 barbs coming my way from his comments, so try not to take it too personally, Abram. It is great to be with you all here tonight. I'm really excited about today's conversation. My hope for today is that we hit a couple different themes, but all of us, including the panelists, myself, and you all here, come away with a slightly different perspective around these questions than you had coming in. So if we do that, that will be what I consider a win. So I'm going to hop right into our conversation, in large part because you can read bios and see all the amazing things that they've done. If I were just to read off their bios, that would take 1 hour and 10 minutes, and we are running out of time already. So I'm going to start out just going across the way and hearing a little bit about your background, what brought you to your own current work, and how you understand that in light of vocation. 30 seconds, Christine.
Wow.
Just kidding.
Backstage, I was told that I would have 2 minutes. So I came to journalism almost accidentally. I studied public policy in college and meant to go into that field. Didn't end up doing that. Ended up in corporate strategy and quickly realized that I cared much more about ideas and sharing them with other people than I cared about selling more widgets for a software company. You mentioned that you had interviewed at a certain consulting company backstage. One of my first interviews for a consulting firm, I walked directly into a glass door. And that is
She's
also...
hired. She's hired.
It's also when I realized that I perhaps needed to pursue a different career path. But I, through a series of kind of lucky breaks, first working at The Economist, doing a fellowship at the New Criterion, an arts magazine in New York, I ended up at the Washington Post and launched the Washington Post's Ideas blog, In Theory. And I found myself in the lucky position of being able to explore in the public sphere what I think of as second-order questions. So not just, what is this headline in the news and what is the hot take behind it, but what are the philosophies, what is the intellectual underpinning of the questions that we're having in public, whether it's, talking about abortion and the underlying question is, what do we think of life? Where does that begin? And what are the different incommensurabilities we're facing here? Or questions of wealth and philanthropy, where the underlying question is, what do we owe to each other and how do we know what is just? And another perhaps career accident that was also in some ways a vocational blessing. During the Me Too moment, I started writing about sort of the headline cases, but then became really interested again in the underlying stories, in what young women and young men were telling me about their experiences and reflected in my own experiences, not just cases of sexual assault writ large, but a real underlying discomfort with the sexual culture, a misunderstanding of how we relate to each other, what sex means, what our sexuality is even for, what messages we were receiving. And of course, I didn't mean to become a sex writer either. But I felt called to kind of delve into that. In fact, just to give people space to recognize and be able to say aloud, like, no, this moment is not good for us. This is unhealthy, and to help them, and myself in some cases, feel like we're the only ones who are dissatisfied. And so Rethinking Sex, A Provocation is my first book, and that's out now. And I am continuing to, I think about the space of sort of social relations, how we treat each other, how we think of each other as people and our human dignity, whether it's understanding a crisis of masculinity, which David has also written about, understanding sort of crisis in our sexual culture, trying to understand the US's fertility declines. But from, I think, a hopefully a broader and higher angle than just what's the hot headline here. So I'm currently the queen of lukewarm takes, but I like it that way.
You know, one of the things that I hope we get at today are the second order framings, the second order questions. So we're going to talk about some things at the surface, but in the midst of that, my guess is we're going to be digging at a couple questions that are deeper, run deeper along the way. So David, for you, what does that vocational arc look like in your world?
Yeah, I went to law school because I was graduating from a small Christian college in Nashville, Tennessee with a political science degree, which very few people were hiring political science undergrads, so I had a choice between flipping burgers and law school. So I went to law school just because I didn't know what else to do with my life, and loved it, and loved the practice of law. And so I was a litigating attorney for 21 years, from 1994 when I graduated until 2015. And my progression is sort of like this. I started off as a commercial litigator working for big law firms, and I was representing churches for free, pro bono on the side, in a number of First Amendment cases. And then that pro bono practice grew larger and larger and larger to where I had to decide, am I going to be a commercial litigator with a pro bono hobby, or am I going to be a First Amendment attorney? So then I decided, well, I felt called to be a First Amendment attorney, and then I became a civil liberties lawyer and was that for a long time. And when you do that kind of law, it's always in the media. If you file a First Amendment lawsuit anywhere, the media is going to cover it. I mean, these are the hot button religious freedom questions. These are hot button issues. You know, if somebody's filing a First Amendment case, it means they've been censored, and they're censored because somebody's really mad at them. Like, you don't censor somebody just because you're mildly annoyed. You censor because you really want someone to suffer. And so these cases were extremely emotional, extremely hot button, and a lot of them were just not covered well by the media. There's a persistent problem in the media of covering law. They're very good at sort of finding out which side they want to win in the case, and then covering on that basis. Not so good at covering the underlying reasoning and the reasons why people should win or lose. And so I started writing pieces every single time I filed a lawsuit. I would write an op-ed in whatever the local newspaper was to just state our case. And I started writing more and more and more. So then by 2015, I was a civil litigator with a writing hobby. And I had to decide, do I want to be a writer? So if you'll pay close attention, at every level, I decreased my earning potential. I went from commercial litigator to big firm to public interest pro bono attorney to journalist.
Podcaster.
And then at the same time, the kids have tuition. This is a bad deal. But so I joined National Review in May of 2015 full time, really with this view that the world was one particular way. And here's how I fit into it. I was a Christian, and I was a conservative, and I was a Republican. And then the very next month, Trump comes down the escalator. And you may or may not know this, but things changed a little bit in American political culture. And some of the, not my Christian identity, but some of these other identities really began to come into question. Beginning in the late fall of 2015, I was like, we're not doing this, are we? We're not doing this, are we? Oh, we're doing this? Well, then I'm not part of the we anymore. And that created a massive change in my life, just a massive change in my life. And so for good and ill, I mean, there were good parts of it and bad parts of it, but conservative media in particular became a very, very interesting place to be. And I like the way my friend Jonah Goldberg, I helped him found the Dispatch. I like the way he put it when we started the Dispatch in 2019, talking about leaving National Review. He said, I got tired of being a problem for my employer. You've heard about cancel culture, I'm sure, and a lot of people who are on the right think of cancel culture as a left-wing phenomenon. I can assure you it is not a purely left-wing phenomenon. I cannot even begin to count the number of people who've tried to end my career in conservative media because of my opposition to Donald Trump. But I will tell you this, in many ways this was a gift because it made me think hard about this country and our culture and why we did what we did as a country. And I'm so much less interested in the ins and outs of handicapping any political race and much more interested in the deeper questions. What is the story behind the story? Why are we here? And so I think it was God's gift in many ways to break me out of my partisan mindset, to liberate me from that partisan mindset, and to sort of put me in a position where I tried to ask, and as best as I could, answer some of the much more important questions about our nation and our culture. And that led me ultimately, and I'm still not quite sure how it happened, to the New York Times, which I started at this year. And just to tell, everyone asks me, how do they like a conservative evangelical at the New York Times? Everybody's been great. They've been super nice. Just as a general matter, people don't come out and say, I want you to work for us, and by the way, we hate you. Like, that's not usually the way it works. So it's been a real blessing so far. And in many ways, the trials of the last 8 years now, my goodness, has been a real blessing as well. And I think not just for me, but for a number of us to really break us out of this partisan shell that we had kind of hardened into, to see things that are deeper and more important.
Nona, what about for you? What is that arc?
Well, first and foremost, thank you all so much for being here. It's such a delight to be here. So in order to explain my vocational arc, I'll have to kind of share a little bit about my faith arc. I grew up in a non-Christian home. My mother, she dabbled in many different faiths. Now that I have that broader context, I know there was like Buddhism and Islam and some other thing. But has anyone ever heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Assessment? Okay, a few people. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Assessment, for those who don't know, it is a survey that essentially will tell you the probability that a given child who has experienced trauma will end up with poor outcomes in life. So criminal involvement, maybe premature death, incarceration, suicide, etc. It's on a scale of 0 to 10. And a 3 is considered really high risk for adverse outcomes in life. I scored an 8. And the reason why I share that is because having not grown up in a Christian home where I did not have a framework for, hope, I did not have a framework for God or any of that, at the ages of 9 and 11, I tried to end my life. And it was shortly after that second suicide attempt when I was in the 6th grade that a classmate invited me to church. And I remember walking into this church thing. People were so kind, so welcoming, and for the first time in my life, I felt wanted. I felt like I belonged. And I remember the first sermon I ever heard, the pastor said that God is a father to the fatherless. And the reason why that was important for me is my father had passed away shortly before my 2nd birthday. And so when I heard those words, it piqued my interest about who God was. And shortly after that, around the age of 12, I accepted Jesus as Lord of my life. And the reason why that's important is because I have essentially lived my life in the marketplace. So I've held executive leadership roles across many private industries, private sectors, but my faith has always been tightly woven around my identity. It was not something I compartmentalized. I was licensed into ministry at the age of 17, started preaching then, ended up marrying my husband who became a pastor. And so for me, I've always lived my life publicly as a Christian. And why that's important is because I've worked, like I said, in many different industries, but most recently, I spent 5.5 years at the company formerly known as Facebook. I often think I'm talking about Prince when I say that. The company formerly known as Facebook, now known as Meta, where I was invited to build the company strategy to work with communities of faith globally. And so I built the Global Faith Partnerships strategy and team from the ground up, and it was very, very much so a cross-faith initiative. So it wasn't just Christian, it was Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish. It was a wonderful, rich experience, and at the same time,
I was thinking about my work because when I started at Meta, I didn't have a tech background. Like, I didn't go into Meta from Apple or Google. Like, I literally came to Meta from the education sector, where I was helping to expand a program nationally to serve girls who are at risk for delinquency. And so when I walked into that leadership role with the company, I walked in almost like a blank slate. I really wasn't sure what social technology was capable of because I had a Facebook account, but I didn't really do anything with it. I posted like pictures of my food, and that was the extent of my engagement. But the more that I learned about what it was capable of, the scale, the reach, the velocity with which we can interact with people all around the world, I realized that there was an immense opportunity for faith communities, in particular for pastors, to leverage social technology for ministry. And so bringing my faith lens to that work was really, really helpful because I immediately saw that there was something powerful that could happen. And then around the same time that you had your like, are we doing this moment, I realized that social technology could also reveal the darker side of the human condition. And so I have been spending a lot of time, I wrote a book a few years ago called From Social Media to Social Ministry, because the idea was, how do we use social media as a tool to make people whole, as a tool to bring people closer to the truth and the life and the love of Jesus, which is why I'm really interested in this conversation tonight, because I believe that social technology has power that we may not be using for the best interests and reasons. Right now, I am serving as Chief Content and Partnerships Officer at YouVersion, which is the maker of the Bible app. We also have Bible app for kids. And so my passion and my heart is really to think about, how does technology become an accelerant for ministry? And by ministry, what I mean is, how do we create platforms where people's needs are being met, where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they are seen and known and loved? And that starts with how we show up in these spaces, how we protect our Christian witness. And so those are things that I'm interested in, and that's the arc of my life.
That's great. All right, so I want to spend some time thinking about the role of writing and community formation and technology in broadly defined changing the world. So I spend a lot of time talking to college and university students. I'm actually working on a program with Abram right now, and we're wrestling with this question of, how do college students find purpose and impact and engage across difference? And so there's a lot of angst around finding one's purpose and shaping the world in a positive way. And at the same point, there's a lot of uncertainty about how one does that. Should I do it through writing? Should I do it in technology? Should I do it in consulting? Should I do it in writing a book? Should I do it at the New York Times? Should I do it in podcasts? So I guess what I'm curious for each of you, and maybe David, let's start with you just to mix it up a bit, how you've formed your own view of what part of the world you want to change, because you can't change all of it, what part of the world you want to change, and what mechanisms you found to be effective and probably to some degree ineffective. I thought I was going to change the conversation here, but it turns out that I couldn't.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something I ask myself quite a bit, actually. What is it that I want to accomplish with my writing? And I think that the best way that I have tried to answer that is there's two major things that I want to try to accomplish. One is, I want to try to explain the parts of the world that I understand the best, that I think really matter to people a lot. And because we can't be experts in everything, right? We just can't do it. But we care about a lot of things that we're not experts in. They do matter a lot. And so there are certain areas that I know, by God's grace, I've been able to work in them. I've been able to study them. I've been able to think about them. And in that area, I want to try to help people make sense of the world. And I think actually that's the area where I've had sort of where I felt like I've had the most success is in helping people make sense of what is happening in some really important areas. And Christine mentioned masculinity, for example. I think the conversation around masculinity in this country is really broken and really corrupted by ideology, when what's happening to young men and boys in this country is much deeper than ideology, much deeper than that. And so that's one thing that I really try to do. And then the other thing is, I try to, if I have a conviction, I try to persuade. And so, one of the things I've really tried to do, especially amongst, because you can't reach everybody, you can't. I come from a white evangelical background, a white evangelical conservative background, and one of the things that I've tried to do is I've tried to introduce a conversation about racial justice, for example, into that white evangelical world in a way that hopefully people can connect with, for example. That's one thing. The other thing that I really try to do is I've really tried to reintroduce many of the principles of the American founding and the Bill of Rights back into our society and culture. Because I've learned that actually what I thought that people understood about our civil liberties and our rights is not what they understood. That the reality was that so many people mixed up power and freedom. And so a lot of people they don't really love it, actually, when they see other people exercise freedom. They don't love it, right? And so what I've really tried to do is introduce and explain how indispensable, both for the church and for the larger culture, is this concept of pluralism and liberty for all. And there's two verses that if you have listened to me at all, you're like, oh, here it comes. Here it comes, Micah 6:8 and Micah 4:4. Two concepts that I'm really trying to introduce. And one, the Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you, O man, what is good? It is to act justly, it is to love kindness, and it is to walk humbly before the Lord your God. Those are three interlocking obligations that are incredibly difficult and also do not tend to characterize Christian engagement in the public square at all, okay? And then the answer is to what end, to what is the goal? What do we hope to accomplish? And then in this I go back to a verse that George Washington referred to almost 50 times in his writing. And I know George Washington had a lot of flaws, but his instinct towards this verse is not one of them. And he most famously used it when the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island inquired of this new president of this new republic, what is our place in this land, this incredibly persecuted religious minority. And Washington responds with Micah 4:4 in this very eloquent letter, every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one will make him afraid. And I've tried to introduce these concepts. What is how do we engage in the public square? Well, we act justly. We cannot leave injustice out there in the name of being nice, right? Injustice, we have to act justly. But you cannot forsake kindness for the sake of justice, and we have to walk into the public square humbly because these things are hard. And so why do we act justly, love kindness, and walk humbly? So that every man can sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And if I can just interject those ideas to some degree, then I will be grateful to God for that.
So David, one quick follow-up point on this. So when you think about the 8 years that you've been in this landscape, and you've talked a bit about how the world changed pretty radically in terms of media, did your view of how effective description, explanation, persuasion change? So in other words, I thought it was going to be easier. I thought these people would be open to it, and they turned out not to be. These turned out to be more open than I anticipated.
The thing that changed was I thought more people were in that business than actually were. Okay, so what I began to learn was that a lot of people who are in the media, the best way to describe them is not so much as commentators or analysts, but as lawyers. And essentially, what does a lawyer do? What a lawyer does is a lawyer always pleads his side's case, always. And so what does that mean? It means if there is something good that my side has done, I'm going to amplify it. If there's something bad that my side has done, I'm going to minimize it. I'm going to make sure maybe you don't even know about it, right? So I'm going to amplify the good on my side. I'm going to minimize the bad, and then the reverse. On the other side, I'm going to amplify their evil and minimize their virtue. Now, that works in a courtroom, which is an adversarial proceeding conducted according to rules of evidence. It is a disaster for the media, a disaster. And for Christians, it's a violation of the Ninth Commandment. For those here in this room who have Reformed bent, go back and read the larger explanation of the Ninth Commandment in the Westminster Confession, and I dare you to read it and not feel really immediately convicted. And it convicts me, and I try to keep it front of mind. And so what I realize is I think one of the challenges is that so many of us were trying to win an argument rather than explain the world.
So, Christine, I'm going to stay with this theme because your trajectory is somewhat similar, different obviously, but you graduate from Princeton, you go and take this path into consulting and are convincing executives to buy things after you crashed into a window, I believe. And you start to say, I want to write. I desire to write. I desire to explore ideas. You write a blog, start a blog in a space, in a column around theory, the importance of theory. To some degree, my guess is you like that because of the fact that you like to write and to explore ideas, but there's probably something there about using these ideas to perhaps persuade, explain. What became your view of, again, using writing to change, explain, describe some part of the world?
Yeah, I also think that this is a really interesting question. I mean, when I think of vocation, the question of vocation, so I converted to Catholicism in college, actually, which came as a surprise to many, including my parents. And in a moment, I think, a period in most people's lives when they're often choosing not to practice faith in a particular way. And the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith has a very particular vision of what vocation means. It's sort of what you are created to do, what you are called to do, what makes you, when you are sort of fulfilling the realist version of yourself and pursuing your sort of truest self, you are within your vocation. Your vocation can change over time. There are vocations to singleness or married life. There is a vocation to family life, perhaps, or a vocation to religious life. There's also your daily vocation, the work that you do and how you do it well. And one way that you know that you are pursuing your vocation is that you feel called to it. You feel like you are where you're supposed to be. And for me, pursuing journalism was a vocational calling, pursuing ideas, because I realized that this was a thing that I loved, and sort of explanation, exploring the world. But as an opinion columnist, on some level, I think we're told that our jobs are persuasion, and it's expected that our jobs will be persuasion. But I often like to think of my work actually as translation. And this also stems from some other, I was going to say weirdnesses, but that sounds negative.
Let's stay with that.
Some other interesting facts about my own background and how I approach the world and approach ideas. So both of my parents, for instance, are Nigerian immigrants, not American. I'm a first-generation American. I am obviously Black, but grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And in part because my parents were not American, kind of didn't realize or didn't fully understand racial tensions until somewhat later in life and from a certain remove. I grew up in a sort of non-denominational evangelical environment. In college was kind of adrift. Still, most of my closest friends are not religious at all, but then I converted to Catholicism and try to practice my Catholicism regularly and fully in my life. I started in business, then I ended up in journalism. And so there are a lot of different spaces that come together in my life and sort of different fields that I want to almost introduce to each other and introduce to other people. And I also want to do that, I think, in a way that is not necessarily lawyerly or even aggressively persuasive, but almost gentle, the seeking out of ideas, the seeking out of understanding in different spaces, whether it's understanding my faith, whether it's understanding politics once I moved to Washington, D.C., and everyone talked about it all the time. Understanding what was going on in America, what were the sort of like underlying threads that all came together to lead to Trump going down that golden escalator and turning 4+ years of all of our lives into a terrible morass of distraction. How do you explain all of those things to other people? And how do you sort of translate the learnings in those different spaces to people who might not have encountered them before? And so when I talk about ideas, and when I was thinking about ideas when I first started at the Post, this ideas blog that I founded in theory, my goal there was to take kind of second order philosophy, sort of academic concepts, and write in a way that translated them into what a reader could understand. You know, most people don't actually want to spend their evenings sort of going back and reading Foucault's treatises on sex, but what if I did it and tried to make it legible to someone else for whom it might be useful, to whom, it was affecting their life. It affects the underpinnings of our society, but they might not know where it came from. What if I, went in and read a bunch of papers and tried to understand AI and the repercussions that it might have on our future, and didn't force everyone to read the technical literature, but tried to get other people to explain that in a way that made it legible? What if I, knowing that, I have a firm Christian belief, tried to explain why Catholics might vote the way that they do on abortion, why Christians have strongly held beliefs on certain subjects, and translate that into the public sphere for perhaps my friends who are not religious at all to understand, like, oh, it's not that you just want to control people, et cetera, much of the dialogue that's had right now around faith. But, what does, say, Catholic social teaching actually say about how we should treat the poor, the immigrant, et cetera? How do I make that understandable to someone who doesn't have that background? And then, so I was doing that, and I find that very fulfilling, this role of kind of almost bridging the gap between religious and non-religious, between, racial conflicts of different kinds, between even just academia and regular life. One thing about a vocation is that it changes you, too. And I found myself doing not just translation, but self-interrogation. So one of the things that happens to you if you are reading a book, or reading papers, or trying to explain a difficult concept that you have feelings about, suddenly your feelings about it become very apparent. Or maybe what you don't know becomes very obvious. So, in writing Rethinking Sex, for instance, oh, the Me Too moment is happening. Oh, here are these things in our sexual culture. Oh, here are these trends in feminism, in progressivism. Oh, I thought I understood this. Wait, do I think that? Who taught me to think that? Did I do that? Am I responsible for these behaviors myself? Am I part of this culture? Have I been acting out a certain story that I've been taught by, whether it's Sex and the City or romantic comedies or anything in between, without realizing it? What does that say about me? When thinking about how faith plays into the question of relational culture, okay, I have a Christian sexual ethic, and I believe in that deeply, but where did that come from? What theology, what verses in the Bible, what support is behind that? And then all of these sort of tropes that I brought along with me. Oh, growing up during the years of I kissed dating goodbye, maybe that did have an impact on me. I should probably unpack that a little bit. Purity culture has informed my view of sexuality in ways both positive and negative. Maybe I need to think about what that means for me as before and as I'm trying to translate our sexual culture for other people. And so sometimes, this work of persuasion ultimately becomes incredibly humbling. And I actually think of that as a gift. I would say, and I think, David, you can probably speak to this too, one of the, I think, trickiest things about being in media and being in a public-facing sphere is the temptation to not be humble, to not self-interrogate, to lawyer, to not admit that you are ever confused or wrong is so strong, especially in this landscape of, spicy tweets and 2-minute cable TV hits. It can be really tempting to just say something that gets attention, take the hardest angle, the sharpest elbow, because people find that entertaining, first of all. And if you do that in the right way and you're confirming someone's beliefs, they will love you for it. Many people don't actually enjoy being pressed into nuance or asked to reconsider something that they already hold deeply, including oneself. So it can be a gift and a challenge, but I'm enjoying it so far.
That's great. So I think one of the things that I find compelling about both your narratives is this idea that there is this migration of ideas between church, society, academia, and the power of how that changes the conversation, as well as the power of how that changes us. I think it's quite compelling. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, when we allow this to change us, it can be pretty impactful. Now, Nona, I want to take a slightly different angle here on this. So, and in particular, to focus on your time in technology and social networks. So imagine that one view of the world is that the way that we are changed as a society, we are changed as a world, is through the spread of ideas. And then another way is that it's a spread of social connection. And it seems to me that Facebook, Meta, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, etc., there's a belief, a certain kind of belief about how the world changes through making connections with strangers, connections with people that you know, and the mechanism of that in shaping ideas. So for you, what drew you to that idea? What were the things that were confirmed in your time there about the value of that type of connection? And what were some of the things that you struggled with, that maybe you believed at the end that this isn't the way that we change the world in the way that I thought?
I love this question because I think about it a lot. I think that the two lanes that you outlined in terms of social connection and idea connection, I think they're actually related. Because the truth is, ideas spread through social connection. And I think one of the challenges that I see in social technology is that people's opinion is given so much weight. The opinion of people that you've never even sat down and had a conversation with, right? People who have literally no credentials, they themselves simply have an opinion. But because there is now a social connection, their idea is given weight. And so I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that social technology has is in, kind of democratizing connection to where I can now have relationships with people all around the country, all around the world who have different opinions and views. What actually happens is I end up with connections that simply reinforce my views. And that is frankly algorithmically programmed, right? It's like I remember having conversations internally naively early on where I was like, well, why don't we just create an algorithm that serves up like opposing views, right? So that we can help people to, expand their thinking and see things from a different lens. And like they just like took the slingshot and were like, I love that idea. Let's shoot it down real fast. Because the truth is, we want to see, and this kind of gets into what you were saying, like we want to see what confirms what we believe, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. That's what we want to see. And so I do think that one of the biggest challenges that's facing social technology, in my perspective, is its economic model. Because as long as money is made on people's attention, and people's attention is directly correlated to engaging with content that, again, confirms what they believe, connections that make them feel safe and comfortable and part of a tribe, I think we're going to continue to see ideas just kind of swirling in silos. And so I don't have the perfect solution, but I do know that's a significant problem. And I do feel like, so here's the thing, my aspiration would be that someone would put energy behind solving that problem. The reality of the situation is, as long as there is, again, an economic incentive to capture people's attention, and the biology and physiology and psychology of attention is related to what I like, I think that's where we have a challenge. To your earlier question, I think it was to David, about this mechanism of writing and the importance of writing, I think that sometimes we think that to share ideas, we have to put it in books and we have to put it in big publications. But I believe in my heart that every single one of us, whether you have 1 follower, 2 followers, 10, 20, 30, you actually have a platform of far more significance than those who are writing books. And I'll tell you why. I read a statistic maybe 10 years ago that said the average American reads half a book a year. I'm guessing that since that's a 10-year-old statistic, it's probably less. But
skewed up by Abram Van Ingen, too. He's
true. I'm glad he's gone.
But 0.25.
80% of Americans are on social media. So what that means is the fastest, most reliable way to share ideas is through social media, and the problem is, again, algorithmically, it is programmed to share the ideas that are the most divisive because those are the ideas that get the most engagement. And so what I would encourage us all to do as just a call to action is to steward our social presence well. Because the people who are following you are literally a captive audience. I have on Instagram right now about 127,000 followers, and I just had a reel that I posted. It was like 1 minute and 30 seconds, nothing long. A reel that I posted that has almost 1 million views. There is no way, I've written 3 books, I have another one coming out next year. I don't have 1 million people reading my books. But there was 1 million people watching this video where I shared an idea. Not everyone agreed with it. Many people disagreed with it, but we had the conversation. And so I just would encourage us to reimagine influence, not as something that requires a book publishing deal, but as something that requires us to steward these social technology platforms with integrity.
So I love this point. In fact, I want to just take us maybe around the horn real quick on this same point. So I could actually spend the next 3 hours talking about the economic model of Facebook and social media. I think that's fascinating, but we only have so much time. So the piece around curating your social presence, given the incentive structure and given the intentional landscape, is challenging. So Foucault on sexual ethics is hard to distill down to 280 characters. And so what I wrestle with in the form of my own writing, my own teaching, my own speaking, is what kind of ideas fit into what type of context? And do we end up worse off if we're in a world where 0.5 books becomes 0.25 books? So for the 3 of you existing in this world over a similar timetable, right? You've seen change, seen change of incentives, you've seen new technology and new platforms. You played around with newsletters and books and newspaper columns and social media and the like. What does that look like for you? How do you think of the types of ideas that you want to convey in their various forms of complexity? How you distill down, package, and share them in ways that addresses the kind of change you want to see in the world? So Christine, why don't you take that for everyone right here?
Take it on the chin, as it were. Again, the economic model question is so important and so disturbing because you're right, Nona, there's really not a solution on the horizon. To kind of the question that started this, the importance of writing, one of the reasons why I think writing is important as a practice, as a vocation for journalists, but also as a thing that we can all do in whatever form you want to, whether it's journaling in private, writing to share things on social platforms, reading other people's writing, is that contra our current moment of 280 characters plus more characters if you are willing to pay $8 a month.
It's another economic model, right? Another economic model.
The act of writing and sort of the act of giving ourselves space to unspool ideas forces you to unspool the idea. If you have the space to write out a column or write out a book or write out even a journal entry about a question, you're spending time thinking about it. You are able to go deeper into the question than you would if you were just tossing off a comment. If you were just in conversation with someone even. You have to sort of sit down and order your thoughts. And then when you are reading someone else's writing, you are able to see the order of their thoughts, question them, draw connections between what you have in front of you and other things you've heard and read, and sort of bring in a more deeply thought, sort of slower ecosystem of understanding that I think is very valuable in this moment when everything is incredibly fast and we're distracted by whatever is the loudest or the most colorful. And I think that writing still has a lot of value there. I mean, there is something about reading a book or a long and compelling magazine or newspaper piece where you watch the story unfold and you can see how different parts fit together in a way that you can't if you just read 3 tweets in a row and then you click off to something else. And I'm a neo-Luddite in some ways because I'm always, pushing people to read more, to log off, to buy books, to buy my book. But I actually think that it's a habit of mind that we would do well to cultivate and in fact have to thoughtfully cultivate in this moment when every incentive, economic and otherwise, and just the amount of time that we have, the 24 hours we have in a day, is to be short and fast and not thoughtful. And so when I think about how to engage on, and also I suppose the other thing about engaging on social media platforms versus, trying to write something persuasive or even something just coherent, is that the incentives, not just the economic incentives, but the personal incentives are very different. Yes, in the act of writing, I want people to think that I'm a good writer. I hope that they will come to agree with me or at least learn something from what I've written. But even that feeling is very different from the feeling of posting an image of myself on Instagram or posting a screenshot of a column I've written or posting a tweet where it's less, did somebody understand what I was saying in this Instagram post versus, do they think that my hair looks nice and is the lighting good and do they like me? I need to know if people like me. I want the likes. That mindset is very different from, do people understand this? Are people taking away something useful? And it's only if you actually sit down and kind of think about the difference, do you recognize how harmful that can be actually, because that tends to be an unhealthy focus for anyone. So I'm kind of spooling here because I think about this a lot and I still don't have a totally comprehensive view of what the best mix of kind of social performance and active sort of contemplative writing is. But one of the things that I think about a lot and that I've actually written about is how quickly our modes of communication and time spent have changed with the advent of new technologies. So we still sort of have, a fondness for the written word. There's still respect for people who write or publish books. But on the other hand, the iPhone has been around for less than 2 decades, less than 15 years at this point, and has completely changed the way that we spend our time. If one used to fill one's time reading the written word, whether a book or the back of a cereal box, as I used to do. There's so much more incentive now to just scroll, to slide through images, text, media, everything sort of jumbled together and kind of take nothing from it. To instead of thinking about something deeply or even lightly for a while, just staring out the window, to think about nothing at all. And I find the practice of writing to actually be an active pushback against that mode of living. And I try and find ways to push back against that mode of living in other spaces too.
So David, I want to take this same question, and then Nona, I'm gonna flip it a little bit for you, because I actually do want to talk about the business model briefly. So David, if you were to think about taking some sort of mix of the complexity of ideas, the mix of different channels, even things like what's a column, what's a newsletter, what's a podcast, why the New York Times versus other venues, and then a selection on audience, sometimes that you can control and sometimes you can't, some who agree with you, some who don't agree with you, let alone the different ways that that information gets conveyed in tweets and retweets and the like. What's the way that you pulled together a personal strategy given the landscape you live within?
That's a really good question, and it's really dependent on complexity. So do not try to communicate a complex idea in a tweet. That might be like the most common sense thing in the world, but you would be amazed at how many people use Twitter as their primary form of communicating complex ideas. It's a really difficult thing to do. So I look at it just as a practical, so I'll go with the practical and then I'll go sort of with the philosophical. Practical matter, the more complex, the more the long form. So, I wrote a book about America becoming so divided it might split apart. That is the kind of thing that if you're going to make that case, you need to make that case. You can't just drive by on that. You've got to explain that argument clearly. I found podcasting is sort of the second layer of complexity, because in a podcast you can have an hour, a 90-minute conversation where you really unpack something in a nuanced way, in a way that also communicates things like tone of voice and humor in a way that it's sometimes more difficult to do in writing. And then the lesser degree of complexity is the column and the newsletter. And there you cannot be too ambitious at all. You cannot. You have to say, there's an idea there's one thought I want to communicate here that at best my readers might remember for a couple days. Think about this. How many sermons have you listened to, and how many can you recall right now that really...
The pastors' hearts are just sinking across.
No, I'm telling on myself. I've written hundreds of columns, right? And the idea that even if somebody's faithfully read, and I say, what are your top 10 columns that I wrote? Nobody's going to get past 3, right? And so you have to be very modest in what your ambition is and very modest in your goal. But I've also found that there is something else that is communicated through the totality of everything you do, and that is your ethos. Okay, and that gets to a really important part here. You cannot and do not fall temptation to compartmentalizing your character. This is something that I did one time. I did this a couple of years ago when I got into a big fight over civility in the public square. That's a great sentence. I got into a big fight over civility. But I went back and I just read my Twitter feed. That's all I did. I just read my tweets for like 3 months worth of tweets. And I was uncomfortable with what I saw. It reflected more anger than I felt. It reflected more frustration or irritation than I actually felt. It had too little Memphis Grizzlies content. There was a lot about it, thank you.
The one Memphis Grizzly fan and the
playoffs. That's right. Playoffs start grit and grind. Playoffs start Sunday. So anyway, it didn't reflect who I wanted to be. And to this day, I struggle with it. It's a medium that is uniquely tailored to make me struggle. And so I struggle with it. And so I do think that whatever form of communication I'm using, whether it's book length to unpack a big idea, a podcast length to try to really work through difficult things in real time, column length to communicate an idea or two, or the tweet, which I don't know what the heck it's doing other than ripping America apart, but communicate the ethos, communicate the core of who you want to be, who you aspire to be. And I think if you look at it like this, because I know too many people who compartmentalize, way too many. I have a great friend, probably one of the best human beings you'll ever meet in your life. But if you read his Twitter feed, you would think he's plotting to kill the general manager of the Tennessee Titans. Just completely unrepresentative of like who the guy is. And so
The one Tennessee Titan fan leaves the room terrified.
Slinks
I've got to let him know.
Slinks away. But so I really do think in many ways that ethos is so important. And real quickly on this point, Jonathan Haidt has been very persuasive to me on this. And Jonathan Haidt talks about persuasion as the art of speaking to the rider or the elephant. And the rider is the rational part of our brain. It's the 2 + 2 = 4. People in this room have heard me say these other parts of the rational part of our brain that say things like, for example, the Southeastern Conference is the best football conference. All of the common sense knowledge, right? And the elephant is everything else. It's your ethnicity, it's your upbringing, it's your background, it's everything else. And you can talk to the rider and you can persuade the rider, but if the elephant doesn't want to move, rider ain't going anywhere. But if you can communicate to the elephant, the rider is coming along. And that's one of the things I think a lot about is how am I communicating to the elephant and what kind of elephant am I? Which is a really, really critically important point. What kind of ethos and what kind of character am I communicating to the world? Because that's what people will remember far more than any given column.
Just one thing to jump in. On the flip side of that, though, this idea of cultivating and caring for one's ethos online and across platforms is that one also has to be wary of caring too much for one's visibility, the sense of self that one is projecting. Because I think one of the temptations of a particularly online and social media inclined age where we have so many spaces where we can present ourselves is that you can get really caught up in presenting yourself. Who is the person that I want to be seen as? What sort of image, what sort of arrangement of squares on my Instagram grid in the right set of colors, projects that I'm like the carefree, like main character with the good energy that I want to, put out there. And you can get so caught up in almost creating a fake version of yourself for public consumption that you can lose contact with the real version. Or find your real version sort of turning into the fake version, which is not real, often not well considered, often is guided far more by the elephant, by our need for approval from the masses or approval from our friends or approval from our church community or, our subliminal but not that sublimated need to please our parents. And you do things that aren't true to you. And eventually that facade will crack and it will fall apart, and then you are left with an experience of nakedness that can be very scary, but also I think very healthy in certain places. And I think we all know, celebrities who have gone through this sort of transformation. But even in the media sphere, even in the writer sphere, you see people who, have written great books, have written great columns, have become, great public figures who are suddenly like, whoa, I'm taking a step back. I need to leave this space and figure out what I came here to do in the first place. And actually, when someone is doing that, that's great. That's a good sign for them. you have to worry about the many people who haven't done that, haven't gotten there yet, and may never do that themselves.
So Nona, I'm going to do one last question towards you, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience that are coming in. I am very curious about the design of this ecosystem. And so I'm thinking of individuals like Tristan Harris, who early on said, we need to get time and attention on positive things versus essentially time on site or eyes on site, and tried to change Google and had a really hard time doing so. You mentioned for yourself trying to find ways to build algorithms that drive difference versus just similarity. We're not going to change the rider and the elephant. That's just a gravity problem that can't be solved. I'm curious, though, whether or not there are experiments around the business model that give a different kind of experience. Obviously, one way to approach it is that people have to pay for their product. So in other words, it's not just advertising based, but a certain fee. But that is challenging from a democratic standpoint, in that you've got to pay to play in some ways, whether you want more than 280 characters or more. So what do you see as being possible in this space? What are experiments that you think companies should be running to evolve a system of dialogue and community and connection that perhaps acknowledges our psychology, but doesn't lead to some of the dysfunctions that we're seeing?
Yeah, well, I do think that one of the serious challenges with social technology is, again, the business model and really trying to drive revenue through engagement, because advertisers want to pay for eyes, right? Like they want to know how many people are using the platform on a daily basis throughout the day. I have not heard of experiments to change that. What I have tended to hear more of is just kind of, trying to wash the dirty pig and try to make it clean up better. I do think that the idea that I shared, and actually we stood up a team at one point to explore the idea, which was really about bridging divides. The idea that if we maybe amplify content that provides legitimate counterpoints, not necessarily just opinions, but like actually verified, legitimate, maybe academic or scholarly counterpoints, that perhaps this would be a way to deal with polarization. That idea did not get off the ground very high, but I personally do believe that that is a responsibility that social technology platforms have, because I would say from the standpoint of education and awareness about the world and about society and about issues, that is primarily coming from social media for most people. When they're standing in line at the grocery store, they're scrolling, right, to see what's the latest blow up that happened today. Many people take their opinions of life and how they should vote and where they should invest their money by people they follow on social media. So I definitely believe that there is a responsibility there. At the same time, one of the things that I love about YouVersion, which I love so many things about YouVersion, is unlike your traditional social technology platforms, YouVersion does not have user-generated content. My team actually curates the content experience through Bible plans and videos and things of that nature. The challenge with traditional social media is it's user-generated content. And so the content that gets the most amplification is the content that's getting the most engagement. But what's the content that gets the most engagement is the content that's the most divisive. And so you end up in this kind of spiraling rabbit hole. But I definitely feel that that is a primary responsibility of these platforms. And so my personal disappointment had always been that there was not investment in that, and I don't know how that investment will happen. I think it may have to be mandated at some level, but I do believe that is a responsibility. I worry also, though, now that there has been such a stripping away in the tech industry. There's been just so many layoffs and so many important projects that were being invested in that were relatively nascent that have been kind of shut down in order to focus on high growth, high profit bets. I think that we're going to continue to see what we have until we have, whether it's a regulatory body or some other force, kind of step in and make a change. But I will say this, users have the power. And that's the part that I think we kind of forget, is that we think, well, it's the algorithm. The algorithm is designed to deliver what we interact with. And so if we decide to interact with if you want to change what you see, change how you engage. you will see your newsfeed change. And so I do think some of that responsibility is also on us, because that change will not happen until there is a monetized reason to do that, from what I've seen.
But that reminds me of persistent complaints we used to get at National Review when we had Google ads and things. Someone would write in, "I'm really upset with National Review because I keep getting these ads of women in bikinis." I'm like, dude.
Sounds like a you problem.
You've been clicking, man. You've been clicking.
It is your user experience.
So I want to go to a couple rapid fire questions, right? So not quite 280 characters, but rapid fire to hit a few of these. And there's a lot of great questions here. We could spend a while. Move back your flights, and we will be talking tomorrow at some point. But one question that's near the top of this list talks about how we engage in the world when you have either, for example, political candidates or leaders who have drastically different ethics, views of the world, theological beliefs, and how do you avoid becoming apathetic? So you can think of this obviously in the context of politics. I was asking a question about political engagement, but the same could be true for a workplace or others. As a person of faith, how do you find ways to engage in that world and not disengage or move away? Who wants to take it? Please.
So there's something I've been thinking about even through this conversation. So when the racial reckoning happened around the time of the pandemic, I was working for Facebook, and I was getting calls from pastors, and they were like, "Hey, we'd love for you to talk about your experience with racism in America. Like, we'd love for you to do a podcast or write an article or something like that." And I thought to myself, well, yeah, I could do that. Of course, I have my own experience with it, but there are people who have dedicated their lives to this issue. And so I was like, how can I use this platform to lift them up and amplify their voices? People like Ambassador Young and Richard Rothstein and Brian Stevenson and all these people. And so what I decided to do is I hosted a week of conversations called Faith and Prejudice, and created a Facebook page, got a few $100,000 of advertising, and we had this week of conversations. And I think by the end of the week, I can't remember if it was maybe 12 or 13 million people tuned into these conversations. And it was really, really powerful to see how social technology could actually be an accelerant for good. But I remember after the very first night that we had this conversation, we featured a woman named Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner. She's a very well-respected civil rights leader at the intersection of faith and also the legal world. And she made a comment about the 2016 election and how that election was adverse for the Black community. And I remember getting all types of emails from pastors who were like, "I thought this would be neutral. You all are racist. You're having these conversations, and this is not what I thought it would be." And that was like a microcosm of what usually happens when somebody is confronted with an experience or content that they don't agree with. My team took a bit of a different approach. Instead of going back and forth and arguing, we engaged in a dialogue, which was, tell us more. I'm not gonna go back with you and say you're wrong. I want you to tell me more about why you feel the way that you feel. And it was interesting because we got to a place of understanding where we may not agree, but we've earned the runway after asking you for your thoughts and how you arrived here. We've earned the runway for you to hear us. And I feel like that's one of the missing links in the social technology ecosystem, is instead of rushing to fight, we need to rush to understand. Start there. I really disagree with that, but tell me more about why you have that position. My team and the organization, we became an organization called Faith and Prejudice, but we would have conversations with people who said we were Marxist, socialist, communist, just called us every name in the book. I remember one time we posted a scripture, literally all we posted was a verse of scripture from the Bible. And there was a thread of comments telling us that we were Marxist. And so it was It was mind-blowing. But what we did is in the comments, we engaged people in a conversation. It's just, so why do you feel that way? Like, help us understand how you see it. And by the time we got through that threaded conversation, so many people realized that they had a knee-jerk elephant response, which was not grounded in rationality. It was based on talking points. That we were able to come to, again, a place of understanding. Not always agreement, but understanding. And so I think when we're having these conversations and they feel so divisive and they're so politically charged and emotionally charged, what I have found is that, especially in social technology, we can't get sucked into it. We have to begin with the mindset, let me understand where this person is coming from. Before I try to educate you, before I try to give you the stats and the figures and the statistics, let me first seek to understand so I can earn the right to be understood.
You know, one thing I think a lot about is the difference between faithfulness and effectiveness, and how we put one in tension with the other wrongly, in this sense. As Christians, we're called to be faithful. And sometimes what we're supposed to do to be faithful doesn't work as we define working in this world. And the example of that is Jesus. So Jesus comes into Israel that is oppressed by the Romans. Now, you may really, in this room, you may dislike Democrats a lot. You may dislike Republicans a lot. They don't hold a candle to the Romans, okay? You want to talk about oppression, we can talk about the Romans. So Jesus, the Son of the living God, comes to an oppressed people who are longing for liberation, and he doesn't liberate them, right? He doesn't even build that huge a following, to be honest. I mean, at one point, he has a big following around him, and what does he say to him? He goes, well, you know, unless you eat my flesh or drink my blood, you can't have a part of this movement. I don't know about y'all, but I'd be done. And he doesn't even explain it. It's not like when they're all walking away, he goes, no, I'm talking about a little cracker. I'm talking about a cracker. Doesn't explain it at all. And then he's killed. He's got like 5 people around him at the foot of the cross. And he comes back. Now, you know, good thing he's Jesus. Good thing it was Jesus and not me, because I'd come back ready to kick some butt. Like, you thought you could kill me? You know? And so, no, what does he do? He goes and he meets with a few people in closed rooms, appears to a few people, and then it goes. Was that effective? Well, in the context of the moment, you would say, no, that's not what I signed up for, right? And so this is what we do all the time, is we know what it requires to be faithful. We know that we're supposed to love kindness. We know that we're supposed to walk humbly. We know that we're supposed to act justly. And the interesting thing there is the emphasis on you acting justly. We know we're supposed to do that. We know we're supposed to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit. We know that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, not earthly power, power of the living God. Again, not give us a spirit of fear, but gave us a spirit of power and love and sound mind. And then we look at this world and we go, well, that's not working. We've got to try something else. And that's where our desperate quest for effectiveness can interfere with our faithfulness. And faithfulness is our call. And we trust God for the effectiveness according to his sovereign will. And that's something that I try to remind myself about all of the time.
I'm going to end with one more question here. And our speakers are likely to be mingling a little bit out with you all in a bit. So perhaps there's opportunities to continue the conversation with them and with each other. But in particular, there's a question about what is the role of a church in stewarding, shepherding, shaping the people around these questions. I can imagine it even going to some of the questions that you raised, Christine, in your book. That's another question of the role of the church to steward those questions as well. So there's church leaders here that are thinking about some of these implications for how they talk to and engage with their own congregation. So just quickly, maybe Christine, we'll start with you here, and then we'll close with any other final thoughts.
Yeah, gosh, so much to say on that last question and this one. A quick throwback to the last question. I think what, David, you were saying about the emphasis being on you to act justly is really important. I think one of the things that makes people very tired in politics is almost an over-engagement that begins to feel futile. Like, oh, I've posted so many angry tweets about Donald Trump and yet he's still running again. Like, it hasn't worked, oh no. And it's like, well, I guess you can keep posting through it, but it's not gonna change. But what action can you take in your life, in your community, in your family that makes a difference, that is tangible? You can sort of, post articles and share articles to your friend about the problem of homelessness in New York City. What are you doing about, the homeless person who you see in your city every day? And will making a change in that small area actually give you much more of a feeling of both faithfulness and effectiveness? Probably. And maybe, focus on your sphere and see what you can do there. And then, as people who spend too much time on the internet always say, touch grass. Just log off. I need to do that more, because just taking a respite from a world of sort of anger and discontent and disagreement, you just can't live like that. That is tiresome, and that is not how we're meant to live. And so just taking a step back can be really helpful. To your actual question, a thing that churches can do, one thing that I, in thinking about sort of the active translation and writing, one thing that I have found very frustrating when I am both trying to explain Christian communities to people outside of them, and then people outside of the communities, trying to translate back into them, is there's often a wide disconnect between what churches espouse, what they say they're practicing, what their sort of stated political tenets are, and what the Bible actually teaches, or what even sort of the structure that their church would say. And so I think that a thing that churches can do to be really effective is actually just go back and look at those verses that you have sort of embroidery hoop stitches of on the wall, or that you've plastered onto your brochures. In the Catholic Church, there is such a thing as Catholic social teaching. That actually gives you very explicit instructions as to, how our faith and religion tells us to treat the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, how we are supposed to give a preferential option to the poor. Do you know that yourself within your church, and could you explain that to someone outside of it? And are you acting in a way that's in accordance with these beliefs that you say you maintain? If so, why not? And similarly, these other more controversial, perhaps, tenets, when you're talking about, sex and sexuality, first, be willing to talk about it. Not just, give your 3 bullet points as to what you heard a few years ago and say, well, figure it out yourself, but engage in community and make sure that what you're teaching ties back to the truth of your faith and to the truth of the love that you're supposed to represent. I think that disconnect is what loses a lot of people.
So I was talking at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary several months ago, and I was asked this question: what book are you reading to help you get you through this time? And I gave the most evangelical answer ever. I said, the Bible. But from this particular perspective, every single syllable of the New Testament and the vast bulk of the Old Testament was written to a people of God who are confronting adversity that we cannot fathom. And what is the message? Faith, hope, love, joy. Then they were also fighting over ideas too, right? They fought over ideas. But then what were the fruit of the Spirit? It was a set of virtues: kindness, peace, patience, gentleness. And here's one thing that I've noticed. I have this wonderful Christian community home in Nashville, and I promise you, we run the political gamut. We have MAGA hat wearing, talk radio listening Republican activists to Bernie bros in our small group, like we do. But we love each other. And how do you know that we love each other? Well, the fruit of the Spirit is all over our small group. It's all over it. And here's one thing that I've noticed. I have noticed that a group of people can tolerate an extreme amount of differences when the fruit of the Spirit is present. When the fruit of the Spirit is not present, you can't tolerate difference at all. It's got to be unanimity or you're done with each other. And so one of the things that I think is so vital right now is to, as we don't forsake ideas, we don't dismiss policies, these things matter. But if in our advocacy for our ideas, our advocacy for our policies, we lose the fruit of the Spirit, we have lost our way. And I feel like we have to recapture the priority, because that's the marker, right? That's like the evidence of the sanctification process, and the Holy Spirit indwelling within us is the presence of the fruit of the Spirit. Not that we have the right idea about politics or anything else. It's the presence of the fruit of the Spirit. And so I just have, and I'm talking to myself, because I know in myself that when those fruit start to wither or rot is the number one tell that I've begun to lose my way.
So many thoughts, and I'll be brief. I think one of the things that concerns me about the state of the church, I would say more so here in America than globally, because globally you get into a whole other like situation with persecution and things like that. What we think is persecution here in the U.S. is nothing compared to being decapitated for your faith. But what's interesting for me is I think we have somehow confused a thirst for righteousness with a hunger for power. And we've come to a place where we believe that if we are aggregating power, that is somehow righteousness. And yet, when I look at the life of Jesus and everything that he represented, it was a literal diffusion of power. The idea that, you know, if you come after me, you will do even greater works than these. There will be even more power if you come after me. And so for me, that's important. And then I think about in Acts, I believe it might have been 18, I could be totally wrong, but where the disciples, they first took they took the faith beyond the Jews, and it says it was then that they were called Christians. It was at Antioch. When the disciples took the faith beyond the Jews, that's when they were called Christian. And I think we have erected so many walls. We have erected so many filters to try to find a way to keep people out and to otherize people that we've lost our way. And so I think my recommendation to the church, which we have to remember, the church is not a place, it's a people. My recommendation to the church is that we have to get back to pursuing the heart of God. And pursuing the heart of God is not going to get us in alignment with any political ideology. It just won't. There's no way, because the entirety of politics is about amassing power, whereas the entirety of our faith is about serving God and serving his people. And so I think if we get back to that, I do believe that we can restore the witness that has been fractured to the nation. And the last thing I'll say is, you kind of alluded to this, David, but I find it interesting that the Bible doesn't say that we'll be known as Christians because of our doctrine, because of our theological purity, and because of how we vote. It says we'll be known as Christians, we'll be known as our disciples by our love one for another. The Great Commission tells us not to go and make members, but to go and make disciples. And disciples are following Jesus. They're not following an ideology. And so if we can get back to that, I think we'll restore our influence in society.
Nona, David, Christine, this has been fantastic. Let's all, again, thank them for the time.
I was going to say let's clap one more time for our panelists, but you just doubled down on that. So to all four of you, thank you so very much. My name is Brent Rome. I'm the board chair of the Carver Project. I've prepared just a short 45-minute sermon that I'd like to present to you. I do just want to sum up. I took down a few quotes, and don't tweet these if I've misquoted. But I just wanted to highlight a couple things. One of the things that David French said is, don't compartmentalize your character. He said, don't try to communicate a complex idea in a tweet. Communicate your ethos. Let's break out of our partisan shell that we've hardened into. And I think the best one was, you've been clicking, man. You've been clicking. That was good. Nona Jones reminded us that God is father to the fatherless, that social technology reveals the dark side of the human condition. She said, I'm moving from social media to social ministry. She said, let's create an algorithm that presents opposing views. And I think she closed with, we've confused a thirst for righteousness for a hunger for power. Christine Emba said, you are pursuing your vocation when you are revealing your truest self. She said, I see my work not so much as persuasion, but as translation. She said, many people don't enjoy being pressed into nuance. And she also said, touch grass, which we'll do in just a few moments. And Peter, one of the things that you said that I just loved, you said, what part of the world do you want to change? Because you cannot change all of it. So thanks again to each one of these panelists. I do want to let you know that if you're interested in learning more about what's next with the Carver Project, you have one of these little postcards. We've got several events coming up. We're going to be discussing housing and justice and law and medicine and mortality and everything else in between. I also want to invite you this evening, if you'd like to go into the lobby, mix and mingle with our panelists, have a bite to eat, have a drink, and as Abram pitched, support the Carver Project. Help us to be able to create more events like this. I think he asked for $50. We'll just add some zeros to that. If you want to do 500, 5,000, 50,000, I think we're capping it at 500,000, Shelley. Capping it at $500,000 tonight. But please do support the work of the Carver Project, and thank you so much for coming. I'll close us in prayer. Heavenly Father, you are so good to us. I pray that we would act justly. I pray that we would love kindness, and I pray that we would walk humbly before you. I thank you for the reminder that the fruit of the Spirit is the mark of the disciple. It is our love for one another. And you have brought us together tonight to be reminded that it is about loving you with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Send us out of here today. Let us be advocates and emissaries of your love in this community and abroad. We love you, we honor you, and we praise you. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. And everybody said, amen, amen. Thanks for coming. God bless you guys.